We'll give it another minute before we begin. I see there's quite a few people still joining today. All right, I guess we'll get going. Good day. My name is Mark Cohn, Executive Director of Marama. Welcome, fellow air quality stewards, to our latest data center webinar, Impacts on the Grid and Other Long-Term Considerations. Today, we have Nancy Seidman, a longtime Mass DEP air quality and energy expert, and Louisa Eberly, a legal expert on the impacts of clean air energy policy. Both Nancy and Louisa currently work for the Regulatory Assistance Project. They will be discussing long-term grid planning considerations, followed by Kristen Martin, an air dispersion modeling expert from the Oregon DEQ, providing us with insight into the health risk considerations of these centers. Thank you, Nancy, Louisa, and Kristen for your insights today. Once again, I want to thank Jesse, who will be managing our question and answer sessions after the end of each session. We will turn on the chat so you can put your questions in at that time. With that, Nancy, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And as Louisa brings up, oh, there we go. Great. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. RAP is so pleased to be invited to participate in this excellent series of webinars on data centers. I'm Nancy Seidman, as Mark mentioned, and I have a long history of working on air quality and energy issues at the state, regional, and national levels. The Regulatory Assistance Project is a global NGO advancing energy and environmental policy, innovation, and thought leadership to help regulators advance a clean energy future. With me today, as Mark mentioned, is my colleague Louisa Eberly, and she'll introduce herself when she begins presenting. Next slide, please. Here's an outline of our presentation, which will take about 30 minutes. We aim to build on some of the issues raised in the first 3 sessions. The speakers have done a great job. Kudos to Virginia and Maryland on their presentations and work to date. We recognize that you're under enormous pressure to permit these sources and that frequently you are the last stop in the process. We will introduce some concepts where we see energy and air quality policies interacting and how they could affect your review of data centers. We'll talk about the impacts on energy use and the grid from data centers. And we plan to raise some questions we hope you'll consider asking of your energy colleagues early in the process, which may influence the outcome in siting and permitting data centers. We recognize that in some cases, the energy regulators don't have a formal role in permitting, but we believe it is really important for you to be working with them, particularly to consider alternatives to siting and permitting hundreds of diesel engines. Our presentation is not meant to question anything Virginia or Maryland have done, but to offer some ideas for projects going forward anywhere in Marama or the other agencies listening in. Next slide, please. First up is a preview of some of the overarching issues we see affecting data center needs, energy needs, and uses. The other sessions in this series have focused on direct environmental outcomes. We're planning to focus more on indirect environmental outcomes, like the variability in forecasts for demand and alternatives to diesel engines. Next slide, please. So we've all seen the rush to permit data centers. And over this series of webinars, you've gotten great ideas from Virginia and Maryland for permitting, compliance, and enforcement. And we've seen how the size and scope of the centers is increasing and that permitting is becoming tougher because of siting constraints and the interest in staying below major source thresholds. We heard from Virginia that some data centers are now considering whether to permit gas turbines to power their own electricity, which can pose other air quality and environmental concerns. The increasing size and scope pose big potential impacts for the environment and public health, direct and indirect impacts, given the number of engines they're seeking to permit and other potential impacts like on water quality and on the electric grid. So we'd like to offer you some options to consider besides diesel generators that will require working with your energy regulators. Perhaps because of the money involved and the number and size of facilities, state legislators are very interested in this issue. We've included an April article from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislatures in our resource slides, which are at the end of our presentation. For example, there's legislation pending in Maryland and Virginia that would require collaboration across agencies. And we encourage that so that the footprints of these facilities can be minimized and the potential cost to consumers discussed up front. And speaking of consumers' costs, Harvard Law recently released a study, which is also listed in our resource slide, showing that residential customers are already footing the bill in a lot of places for grid upgrades that serve only data centers. Energy affordability is critical, and there are a lot of potential tools utility regulators and state policymakers can leverage. We don't have time to get into that today, but would welcome more of a conversation on cost shifting in the future. The good news is that we believe you have good opportunities to influence the outcomes through regular and continued communication with your energy colleagues. And we are happy to work with you on an ongoing basis to consider the alternatives we're going to discuss today. Next slide, please. So here's our perspective on places where you can influence facility design for the data centers and potentially new electricity generation that is seen as being needed in your area. With more data centers wanting to be permitted, there are opportunities for these companies beginning their siting and permitting process. We list 3 areas for potential involvement. First, we'll raise questions you can ask and note that early involvement with developers and your energy colleagues can help review and discuss alternatives to engines and facility size. Second, we include some particular areas for collaboration with others in your state. For example, we're going to discuss the uncertainty in load forecasting more in the coming slides. Second, we list data transparency, meaning the need for you to get all of the information you need on the potential impacts on energy and water use, for example, as well as a facility's ability to be flexible in their use of electricity. We want the developers to be upfront about their needs for power and their expected usage to help you with options and permitting. The rest of this list will be discussed later in our presentation. Third, we believe all of these areas warrant discussion with your energy agencies early and regularly, regardless of whether they have a hand in permitting. For example, you could be involved in their regular energy planning efforts, and they could be involved in your SIP planning efforts. Next slide, please. Our second topic concerns the energy and air quality impacts of data centers. Next slide, please. In this section, we'll review the variation in forecasts and the need for energy and the need for data centers. We'll talk about PJM specifically, though we know there are people from other parts of the US here today. And we'll touch on PJM's emission status. I know most facilities are permitting emergency generators, but frankly, it worries me that much unused capacity is sitting around, not to mention the amount of money that's been invested. I expect you will get pressure to allow them to run more. And if those engines are used more, as you know, the air quality impacts would be severe. We believe there are alternatives to consider, and we want to help you approach your energy colleagues about those options. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with national forecasts for energy, for the expected energy demand from data centers. And earlier I talked about the wide variation in forecasts, so we wanted to provide a few examples. Before I get into the graph, I'll mention that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, published a State of the Markets report for 2024 that was just published, and they used a figure of a need of 13 to 55 gigawatts of new demand from data centers across the US by 2030. The graph we've included here comes from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, or LBNL, and you'll note that there's a factor of 2 in the difference between the highest and lowest forecasts, the lower down in the right quadrant, and then the upper right area. That range is a range of 200 to 400 terawatt hours of demand between 2020 and 2030. I think this matters because you'll want to discuss the variability in forecasts with your energy colleagues. Next slide, please. And as has been discussed in earlier webinars, geography matters. data centers are being clustered due to the access to fiber optics, close to population centers, as well as factoring in the cost of energy. So we wanted to put the size of data centers in context with other facilities in the electric grid. As you know, the size of individual facilities is increasing dramatically, with so-called hyperscalers becoming a bigger portion of the market and their proposals increasing in size. So first, in light blue, we show Meta's proposed facility in Louisiana that would be powered by about 2.3 gigawatts of new gas generation. Second, we list the Palo Verde nuclear plant in Arizona, which has just under 4 gigawatts of capacity, in yellow there. Third, OpenAI has discussed pursuing a 5 gigawatt data center, now shown in dark blue. And finally, we show the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington, which has the largest electric generation capacity of any power plant in the US at about 7 gigawatts. We hope this is helpful, and we acknowledge that these are examples at the high end of the projects. Next slide, please. So now let's focus on PJM, since I believe a lot of the audience is from those states. As I imagine you've heard, the 2025 forecast is much higher than the previous year, shown here with blue and then green, with higher projections for near-term growth. And today, interestingly, there was an article in the Cardinal News of Virginia in the southern part of the state, raising the specter of rolling blackouts in a few years due in part to data centers. But they also noted the PJM is working with FERC to clear the backlog in projects waiting to be approved, including new gas generation. And Dominion was quoted about some of the large renewable energy projects they have in construction. And we can provide a link to this article if you haven't seen it. So in the graph, the green line is the 2025 forecast, and the blue line is the 2020 forecast. And I would note this is the summer peak forecast. On the next slide, we'll talk more about the variation in forecasts in PJM. But keep in mind that in the prior graph, we had a range of a factor of 2 in the forecast for demand, while this is showing an increase of about 50% just between last year and this year. With higher demand is forecast in the short term, which is perhaps more accurate, and lower demand further out. And you'll also see, for example, that the summer peak has been vacillating as well by at least 10% in the brown or gray line to the farther left in the graph. So there's wide variation in these all the time. Next slide, please. So given the variability in forecasts, we're raising the question of whether new generation is needed at all, which we know is provocative. While it's clear that there'll be an increase in demand for data centers in the next few years, further out, it's very hard to predict. The charts on the left here come from FERC and shows the variation amongst US energy markets with darker red representing the newest forecasts. Note the steep red curves in almost all of these 6 graphs. But you can also see how often the forecasts have proven to be inaccurate by comparing the lighter lines in the yellow and lighter orange to the red lines. And we can focus on PJM is there in the lower left. And there's a significant drop from the 2014 forecast in yellow compared to the red as of now. So we list 6 reasons on the right for the difficulty in forecasting, including, for example, the rate of AI adoption by the US by users and the state of the US economy. And all of these are important and represent questions you can ask of the developers about when their interest for a facility is first known. We're happy to answer questions about any of these 6, but we're going to focus on 2 and 3 in today's presentation. Next slide, please. But before we go on further on flexibility options, let's circle back to PJM and air quality. I was impressed with the Virginia ozone statistics in the second webinar. So just for fun, I checked on the available PJM emissions data and didn't see as much progress in lowering NOx emissions as we might have expected. And the report I cite here also includes CO2 and SO2, if you're interested. So note the variation in the average in the 2 peak lines, orange being the system average, green being marginal off peak, and blue being marginal on peak. PJM still sees some very high variation in NOx values in peak time and some high levels. And obviously that affects all of your ability to reach attainment. My point here is that in questioning the need for new generation, including backup generation, and the size and scope of the data centers is important, because reducing overall demand and using flexibilities available through new technologies on the grid and through operations can contribute to improvements in air quality and provide options other than relying on fossil generation. So Louisa is going to be talking more about these issues in the coming slides. And with that, please take it away, Louisa.
Thanks, Nancy. Hi, everyone. I'm Louisa Eberly. I'm a senior associate with WRAP. So picking up from what we know about these potential energy impacts, this next section is focused on highlighting potential strategies to mitigate data centers' indirect emissions impacts through their energy consumption. This is a short roadmap of the rest of our presentation. We'll start at the source with ways to reduce the demand from data centers at the facility level. And then we'll talk about load flexibility and battery backup in a bit more detail. Then we'll talk about what the options look like if there's still a need for more generation capacity. And finally, we'll go over some questions at the end. We'll leave you with some questions that you might want to ask of applicants or your partner agencies. So starting with what can be done from a facility design or on-site perspective, we have a few options. The graphs that I'm going to click through here all show a hypothetical load shape, meaning the variation of electricity demand throughout the day. So a data center's exact load shape might be a little bit different than this, but they will have some variation throughout the day. And this visual is really meant to help illustrate how load can be managed. So the lighter blue shading represents the system peak, meaning that time when the grid is most stressed overall. For example, in the afternoon, in the summer, when people are coming home and turning on their ACs. Most new grid resources are built to serve a small number of peak demand days and hours. And here we have a facility that has an increase in demand during that same peak period. But if instead data centers can help avoid exacerbating these peaks, they can really reduce the need for new generation, and that's what we're targeting here. So energy efficiency reduces energy demand overall and produces no air pollution. This is a simplified visual, and we're assuming here that energy efficiency reduces the demand consistently across the entire day, including during that peak window. There is a bunch of ongoing research regarding efficiency options for facility operations at data centers, as well as the hardware and software running on those computer chips. I will note here that the more energy efficient options for cooling are water-based, which raises a trade-off between water and energy usage. Another option is load flexibility. So flexibility is based on the ability to change that load shape in response to signals from the utility or the energy market. Flexibility can be used to reduce demand during these key peak periods, as shown here. And a recent frequently cited study from Duke University found that even curtailing only 0.25% of the maximum annual energy consumption of new loads could actually open up 76 gigawatts of new load that could be integrated with existing resources on the grid. And the average duration of the curtailment events that were studied in this report were only 1.7 hours long. So we're talking about a small amount of curtailment. And then the International Energy Agency also issued a report last week that highlighted flexibility as one of the key strategies for addressing data center demand. And both of those reports are linked in our resources slides at the end. Flexibility can also include shifting the load to match the production of solar energy. Data centers could use on-site batteries, for example, to soak up power when it's clean and cheap, and then discharge power to offset the demand during that grid peak time. Another option is shifting workloads in real time to data center facilities that have lower emissions profiles. For example, Google has been doing this with a tool that it calls Carbon Aware. There are a lot of other flexibility options that are being studied, and EPRI's DC Flex initiative is one example of places looking for data center flexibility solutions. And then the last option listed here is on-site clean generation, where the facility provides its own power entirely or part of the time, while load flexibility is more short-term and dynamic, really responding to those market or utility signals. On-site generation can meet a facility's needs on an ongoing basis, regardless of what else is going on with the grid. Ideally, of course, any on-site generation will still be designed to avoid exacerbating these same peak issues. For example, solar photovoltaics are one of the cheapest and fastest resources to deploy, and pairing that solar with batteries on site can help alleviate strain on the grid during those peak periods. So from this last slide, we know that batteries can be one crucial tool to mitigate data center impacts. And this slide evaluates the potential for batteries to pull double duty, providing load flexibility in addition to emergency backup. So let's start with cost. A 2019 study from the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, found that the life cycle capital cost for a Tier 4 compliant diesel generator is about $800,000 per megawatt. And NREL's annual technology baseline for 2025 estimates that the capital expenditure for a 4-hour battery storage system is $1.2 million per megawatt, and for solar plus storage, it's $1.6 million per megawatt. And both of those last two numbers assume utilization of the investment tax credit. There are other emerging technologies that can provide longer duration energy storage, but these numbers listed here are for lithium-ion batteries that are commercially available now. Importantly, all of the numbers in this table exclude maintenance and fuel costs, and when you account for all of those costs, diesel isn't as competitive. And beyond cost, batteries can bring a lot to the table. A big one in this context is the lack of direct air emissions. Batteries do have to be charged though, so acknowledging that if they aren't charged with on-site renewables, the emissions impact will depend on what kind of electricity is used for charging, but grid power is getting cleaner and will continue to get cleaner over time. Batteries also play a big role in load flexibility that we just talked about. Diesel generators have a lot more restrictions on how much they can run because of their associated air emissions. For example, we heard in the prior sessions that Virginia has some pretty strict limits on using the diesel gensets during outside of true emergency situations. Batteries, by contrast, could discharge a lot more often to help mitigate these energy demand problems during those peak periods of grid stress. And they could do all of that without the emissions downside. And in addition to being helpful to the grid, avoiding demand during those peak periods can also bring potentially significant bill savings to the facility operators, which could help balance out the cost. And batteries can also enhance resilience. A different NREL study compared diesel generators with a hybrid microgrid backup system that swapped out some of the diesel gensets for solar and batteries. And they found that the hybrid system actually was better at meeting the critical load needs for the hypothetical facility during a 14-day outage than the diesel generators by themselves, and that the hybrid system did this at the same or lower lifecycle cost. So more analysis would be required to understand the economics and benefits from batteries in your state or at particular facilities, but it's a good question to consider raising with applicants and/or your partner agencies. In a first that we are aware of, Mark Cohn recently sent us a permit that includes solar and storage for backup at a New Jersey wastewater treatment facility. So this is really exciting, and RAP would be happy to partner with any regulators interested in exploring this further. So if there is still an increase in energy demand after applying these strategies that I just laid out, there is a range of non-emitting options that you can encourage your energy offices and PUCs to evaluate together. From this list, I'll mostly focus on transmission. Transmission can mean increasing access to low-cost, clean resources and can reduce curtailment of those resources, as well as the need for new fossil generation. For example, ISO New England recently issued a request for proposal for new transmission to connect onshore wind in northern Maine with new data center demand in southern New England. Now, building new transmission is a non-trivial feat, but things like advanced transmission technologies may be able to increase transmission capacity more quickly. In that International Energy Agency report from last week that I referenced, they found that using advanced tools to manage existing transmission assets, specifically adopting more remote sensors and AI-based line management, could unlock more capacity by 2030 than what they forecasted for the new demand from data centers in their base case. GridLab also has a great recent report that looks at ways to optimize existing transmission capacity by unlocking the surplus capacity that's currently reserved for more expensive and polluting power plants, but that really isn't being utilized. Both of those reports are also linked in our references slide. And for new generating assets, I won't walk through this whole list, but I do want to note that we're talking about adding incremental clean resources rather than siphoning off the existing resources on the system. For example, removing an existing nuclear plant from the market could increase scarcity and cost, and the resource that's added to backfill could be more polluting as well as more expensive. So one way to head off that concern is by ensuring that data centers are bringing in incremental clean power to serve their needs. And they could do that through on-site generation or direct purchases and special agreements with their utility. The exact details would depend on the jurisdiction. And this slide lists a few of the potential options for the types of resources that they might be looking at. Some of these are going to be faster to bring online, and it's worth asking your energy offices and PUCs which of these are the most viable to meet that short-term supply crunch in the next few years, where we have more certainty that there will actually be this increase in demand. Oh, sorry. And so integrating data centers into the grid is complicated, but we know that regulators play a key role in ensuring that communities can actually benefit from these facilities. So this is a recap of what we've covered and a few things that we want you to keep in mind moving forward. We'll leave you with these issues reformulated into questions that we can put up at the end, and you all can take in the slides We'll send them out in the slides after. So today we talked about the challenges with forecasting as well as the opportunities to influence facility design, particularly around load flexibility. We also looked at some of the non-emitting resource options. Looking forward, you can consider whether data centers could be conflicting with your state's clean energy goals, and if you could be looking at other alternatives. One issue we're particularly interested in discussing is whether batteries could be considered backed instead of fossil backup generation. And lastly, Nancy mentioned at the beginning those cost concerns about costs being shifted to residential customers to pay for the grid upgrades to serve the new data centers. And that's also something that you could be working with your colleagues to avoid. And now I will pass it back to Nancy to close us out.
Great. Thank you so much, Louisa. So we hope we piqued your interest in collaborating with your energy colleagues. We hope we provided you with some ideas that could help improve public health with the new technologies that could be used to avoid fossil generation. And we think that asking questions can help you push the envelope on data center. We know you have a lot on your plates now, and we want to make your job easier going forward while recognizing that this is an investment that you need to make in collaboration for the future. So in summary, our takeaway is that we feel air regulators bring an essential perspective to collaborative energy conversations, and you play a key role in facility design. And that exercising your voice is crucial given all the uncertainties about energy and environmental impacts of data centers. Next slide, please. So we have two slides. We've talked about a lot of different reports, and so we have this slide and then the following slide, which will go out in the PDF, which have live links to what we've mentioned. Then we have our contact information. And finally, as Louisa mentioned, oh, we have our list. Yep, we have our questions that we think you might consider asked. We've tried to give you some prompts for talking to your energy colleagues. And with that, we are back to Jesse. Thank you all so much. We appreciate the opportunity today.
Wow, thank you so much. That was so informative, Nancy and Louisa. So I have the chat turned on. If folks want to drop, oops, sorry about that. Oh no. There we go. If folks want to drop any questions into the chat for Nancy or Louisa, and then if you see a question that you're also interested in asking, you can react with a thumbs up, and that will kind of encourage us to prioritize that question if a lot of other people have the same one. First question, could more use of heat pumps for cooling help?
That's a good question, and it's one we've been looking at in Maryland. And I think that the short answer is yes, because in particular in the Marama states, as the temperatures are warmer, and you already have a lot of heat pumps, and in particular most homes have air conditioners, frequently they are not as efficient as the newer heat pumps are at providing cooling. So you can get an energy benefit from getting people to switch to heat pumps. Great question.
I'm not seeing any other questions yet. I'm sure more will come.
Jesse, you could go back to our list of questions maybe for a minute. See
Yeah,
if that,
absolutely.
okay, there we go.
Perfect. Oh, there is
Oh.
one. I'll do
Yeah.
this one first, and then we can go back to this slide. Do you provide the link to the news article in Southern Virginia that you mentioned early in your presentation?
We did not. I will get that right now and put it in the chat, unless Louisa, you already have it teed up, which
I don't have it yet, but I could
okay,
grab
I
it.
will get it. What's
Okay, we have a comment. Our recent data center applicant says time is of the essence and they don't have time to wait for more efficient emergency options. They can easily get diesel engines. More of a comment than a question. And another comment, as we continue to rely on electronics and electricity, projects like this that require a lot of electricity should be required across the country to utilize fossil-free electric production methods as part of the project.
So just to chime in response to the question about, or the comment about time being of the essence, I think another way to think about the issue more holistically is how quickly can they get connected to the grid, and doing things like bringing in batteries and that flexibility that can enable them to plug into the grid more quickly, because the utility can count on the ability to curtail them during those most critical periods. That can enable them to get plugged in more quickly. So there may be trade-offs in the types of connection that we're talking about. And we've seen examples, for example, in Texas and California, there are these interruptible rates where the utility maintains the ability to cut off some power to the data centers, not just data centers, but large loads in general. And they're able to both avoid expensive upgrades to the grid, but also those upgrades can be time consuming and really slow things down. So having more flexible options at the facility themselves can impact other aspects of the broader picture of getting these things online. I see more questions are coming in too. So
yeah, there was somebody who said it's just a comment, but I want to comment on the comment, which was about, if I might, about requiring fossil-free energy. And that article that we mentioned from the Environmental Legislators Conference, National Conference of Environmental Legislators, that has some examples of legislation. And I think it was Minnesota, Louisa, where a bill like that has been introduced. to require that any new energy, any new generation they need be fossil free. I see another comment on the federal administration to prioritize clean energy versus fossil fuel sources. Well, a lot of states are prioritizing clean energy on their own. I agree with you. Certainly the federal government's help would be good, but as we've seen before, states are going to be taking the lead on a number of issues, and this may be another one.
I think there was also just a report from the EIA that came out that found clean energy is still moving forward nationally, and will continue to fill out the electric grid regardless of kind of what happens at the federal level. There's a lot of momentum going there.
And in general, it's been shown time and time and again that it is now the least expensive way to generate energy. There's a good question about authority, that the air regulator's authority is limited, and because emergency generators have already been established. I think that's why we were so excited to see the New Jersey permit. It's always hard to be first, so many kudos to New Jersey, but I think hopefully that will give a number of you the opportunity to say, hey, we've got this permit in Jersey. We want to think about this, and we want to at least discuss it with you as to why this is not an option you're proposing. Oh, thank you for the comment from Minnesota about the bill. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a link to more information about that too that you wanted to share, Jenna Ness. That would be great. Another question here. Has there been any successful installations of battery backups at a data center in lieu of backup generators? Have the safety and reliability been proved out yet?
So I'll jump in and say I'm not aware of specific examples of battery backups being installed yet instead of those diesel generators. On the safety and reliability piece, there was that NREL study that I referenced where they looked at replacing diesel generators for microgrid, replacing the diesel generators with a hybrid microgrid. And they found that the kind of survivability rate, meaning the ability of that microgrid to serve the needs of the load over a 14-day outage, was better when you were swapping out and including some solar and storage instead of the diesel generators. And that is linked in the resources slide.
And I want to emphasize one point that maybe we didn't emphasize enough, which is that we're not necessarily advocating that no diesel generators be sited at a data center. We realize that would be a really heavy lift for all of you. But, we've heard of 300 or more diesel generators. It wouldn't necessarily need to be that all of, let's start incrementally. If we could get a place where, say, a third of that is replaced with solar and storage. Because as Louisa mentioned, there's a whole lot of other benefits to having batteries on site at a data center that you don't get with diesel engines, which have which you all have appropriately limited in the amount of hours they can run.
Thanks. Okay. Other question here. Have you read the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson? If so, can you discuss how your policy advocacy fits within the abundance framework advocated by Klein and Thompson? Possible examples are expedited permitting for clean energy projects. And thank you for your presentation.
I have heard of that book. I have not read it, but it's a great question. We can think about that. And obviously, expedited permitting has pluses and minuses, as you all know, and I'm sure you've been through the ups and downs in that in your state when you get a directive to do one thing faster, and then 2 years later you're supposed to do something else faster, and it goes back and forth. But so I don't have a good answer for you. It's a great question.
Okay, next one. Have you analyzed the impact on demand of AI learning and training? I've heard that there are economic pressures for data centers to run pretty continuously while that process is going on, which could reduce flexibility of workload.
Yeah, I can jump in on this. So my understanding is that there are different types of load requirements when we're talking about data centers. In the AI context, when we're talking about training the new models, those can be pretty geographically flexible before they get started. But as the commenter noted, once they're running, I think they kind of have to just keep running until they're done. But because they're more isolated, they don't need to be located at data centers close to populations, for example. They can be sent to more rural data centers that might have, be close to a solar field. So you can optimize this, and that's what Google has tried to do with their Carbon Aware tool. And then there are also steps that you can take with other types of the workloads, like the inference, which does need to be closer to the population centers. Those are more perhaps flexible in real time, but have more of the geographic constraints. So it's kind of looking holistically and optimizing how you can move things around. But I do think that there are limitations to how much of this we can actually do through shifting workloads in that way. It's certainly helpful, but I don't think it will get everything that's needed.
Great, thank you. Okay, last question for now, at least. I think we have time for maybe a couple more after this. In what ways could data center companies be incentivized to create their own local power plants, such as solar or miniature nuclear? Should provisions be made for such a plant to feed its excess energy into the national grid? The scale of large projects now are large enough and expensive enough to make producing their own continuous power viable.
So that's another great question. I can think of two ways. There are already, well, one way you have an incentive, which is the major source thresholds that people are trying to avoid. And obviously, if they don't permit as many engines, then they've got, they can still permit more power, but it's not all engines. The second one is, as we were mentioning before, is like in Minnesota, the legislature could prompt this through requirements. And I would say the third one is, and particularly on connecting to the grid, and Louisa and I could have spent the whole time today talking about rate designs and how rate designs could incentivize this type, to address this question. But that's a really key role for your energy regulators, is to provide those incentives for if they generate their own power, what they get paid for it, if it serves their own load, or more importantly, not as importantly, if it would go out to the grid in other times. So that's the perfect place for collaboration.
The other thing I would add there is that we've talked already, and some of the other questions got to this, the urgency. These things want to get connected as quickly as possible. And the more that they can provide their own power, the lower the amount of connection that they're going to need to the grid, which can reduce the need for expensive, but also potentially time-consuming grid upgrades. So if they're able to kind of meet 90% of their requirements on site, that will just reduce the kind of scale of their connection and can help them get on more quickly. So making sure that that's accounted for in the kind of the utility planning process is another way to help incentivize, in addition to other rate design strategies that, as Nancy mentioned, we could talk about a lot more, but in the context of this conversation, we just didn't have enough time to really get into.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question. Try to triage the 3 questions on here. Okay, are there concerns with large battery installations catching fire?
I don't know if Nancy wants to jump in on this too, but I mean, my understanding is that fire-related risk at battery installations is there are a lot of steps being taken to make sure that these risks are really, really mitigated. And it's really not common for batteries to have these kinds of issues. That said, like, there are steps that can be taken in zoning and things like that to help make sure that any impacts would be limited. But my understanding is that really there have been a lot of steps taken to reduce those risks. but Nancy, feel free
Yeah,
to
well,
chime in.
and I recognize there's a lot of concerns with new technologies, but as you all have seen, like when I heard Virginia talking about the amount of diesel fuel that needs to be stored for the backup generators, obviously there's other issues with diesel generators that we're used to assuming those risks, so we don't think about them as much as things like with new technologies. So I agree with what Louisa said about the work being done to ensure the fires are uncommon and infrequent and small scale. So what we could try to answer some of the other, I know we want to give Kristen her time. So we could try to answer some of these in the chat. Oh no, you're going to turn the chat off, but we'll see if we have time at the end.
Well, I could leave it on for a couple minutes if you wanted to respond. You know, in the chat, we could also, if there's time, we could try to get to them at the end, or we could respond to these folks after the webinar if you have answers to these questions. But yeah, I think we want to go ahead and move on to our next presenter, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think about getting people resources. Yeah, in particular, we can help with.
Great.
Thank you.
Perfect. All right, Kristen, you all good? Ready to take it away?
Yeah, I think so.
Wonderful.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, hello. It's morning here in Oregon, so good morning. My name is Kristen Martin. I'm an air quality modeler here at Oregon DEQ. I've been here for about 6 years now, and prior to that, I was at Montana DEQ for about 6 years as the air quality meteorologist. And then prior to that, I am an East Coaster at heart. I've lived in Virginia, North Carolina, and I grew up in upstate New York. I also today am an example of why all you state employees should take your IT training and don't click on links, because DEQ was hit with a cyber attack last week. We have had to turn in our computers. They're being fully wiped and we do not have access to our network. So I will be giving this presentation from my little work cell phone. So if you see me squinting, that is why it's very tiny. So take your trainings. So anyway, I am here today because we represent in Oregon a little bit of a different take on data centers. And in particular, we have a very modeling heavy approach to permitting new data centers. And so I'm going to talk through both our air toxics program and what we call our short-term NACS program that really aims at the 1 hour NO2 and the PM 2.5 24-hour standards. So next slide, please. So first, just a quick look at what it looks like for data centers in Oregon. We've seen a really big increase in the last 10 years, really the last 5 years in new growth in data centers. In particular, 2 locations in our state. First in Hillsboro, which if you're not familiar with Oregon, is kind of a little bit of a distant suburb of Portland in Northwest Oregon. And those centers are very close together. Many of them are neighbors with each other, but they represent a little bit of a smaller facilities. Many of those facilities have between, say, 30 and 70 engines, although we do have one of our bigger facilities with 150 engines in Hillsboro. Over in Boardman-Hermiston is another area where we see just a large amount of growth. Every single one of those facilities is an Amazon facility, and they have right around 100 main generators at each of their facilities. We also see activity in the Dalles and Prineville, although there hasn't been as much new development in those areas over the past 5 years. As far as what types of engines we see, so far, primarily, that's been tier 2 engines, so uncontrolled engines. About 80% of our engines are uncontrolled. We are starting to see more controls move in, and right now we're at about 20% with some type of controls. Some of those are just with diesel particulate filters, while others do have the full gamut of tier 4 compliant controls. Next slide. Okay, so what do Oregon regulations look like and how do they impact data centers? Here in Oregon, we have a program called State New Source Review, which triggers when annual emissions are above the significant emission rates. So the real driving pollutant is NOx for that. So data data centers, almost all of our data centers are below 40 tons per year of NOx. They take a limit to stay below 40 tons per year, therefore not triggering state new source review. We do have 2 data centers out of our, I think, 37, although we get applications all the time for new ones. Sorry, the chat popped up there. 2 of them are above that state new source review trigger, but we do not have any data centers that are exceeding those Title V major source thresholds. And they do take enforceable limits to stay below those Title V thresholds. And the difference between a Title V threshold and the state new source review threshold in Oregon is that they include emergency activity to stay below Title V, and to stay below that new source review threshold in Oregon, it is just their testing and maintenance non-emergency activity that is counting towards that. So there's a little difference there. And I can talk more about that if people have questions at the end. But so while they don't have to do the traditional modeling that you'd associate, Appendix W, EPA modeling for criteria pollutants for state new source review, we do trigger modeling for 2 other programs. So starting in 2018, Oregon legislature instructed DEQ to create an air toxics program, which we call Cleaner Air Oregon. It requires all new facilities to conduct a health risk assessment for the community nearby the facility. And so all of our new data centers since 2018, which as you saw in that graph, there's been quite a few that have come in the past 5 years, have to do this risk assessment. And I'm going to talk through what that entails in just a little bit. And then second, in 2021, our air administrator issued an internal management directive that required all new sources to evaluate what we call the short-term NACs. In Oregon, the ones we're concerned about are the 1-hour NO2, the 1-hour SO2, although that's less of a concern for data centers, and the 24-hour PM2.5. And so what this program means is that even if you're below those significant emission rates, and not triggering a formal new source review modeling analysis, you still must show compliance with those short-term NACs standards. And for data centers, that involves having to do additional modeling. So next slide, please. So what does that mean? How much modeling have we buried ourselves in for data centers in Oregon? We've had 20 facilities conduct a Cleaner Air Oregon risk assessment. We've had 21 facilities have to conduct short-term NACs analysis. And then really what bogs down our workloads quite a bit in Oregon is the modifications. And so if a facility that's came in to be permitted since 2018, 2021, has a modification, they have to redo both their Cleaner Air Oregon risk assessment and their short-term NACs assessment. And so by my count, we've done over 70 modeling reviews for data centers. I'm counting the Cleaner Air Oregon toxics modeling review and a short-term NACs modeling review separately. And while, of course, some of the basic air mod information would be the same between those, so met data, facility layout, there is a lot of differences both in load and stack parameter for the 2 different analyses. And then also very, very different post-processing analysis. Conducting a risk assessment on many chemicals and their toxicity is on the toxic side. And then on the NAC side, we typically see a Monte Carlo evaluation done, which I will talk through in a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a Cleaner Air Oregon risk assessment in Oregon? These are the steps that we go through for a risk assessment, and I'll kind of gear these steps towards what it means for a data center. So for an emissions inventory, we have over 600 what we call toxic air contaminants that if released by a facility, they must evaluate the risk from. For data centers, of course, it's the combustion of that diesel particulate matter that we are concerned about. And we have done a significant amount of source testing now for toxic air contaminants on these diesel generators. And we have default emission factors for all of the pollutants that we are concerned about. So the emission inventory is a pretty straightforward process for data centers. in our Clean Air Oregon risk assessments for other types of facilities, this part can be a very slow process, trying to identify what tax are released from what processes and how much. So moving on to the modeling protocol, this is where they will specify the typical things, what metadata they're using, what is the layout. But for Clean Air Oregon, they're also specifying they need to do worst case modeling and also think about what type of permit conditions they want. Are they wanting a facility-wide permit limit or an individual engine permit limit? They'll specify how they're going to model to achieve that goal. Next is what we call a risk assessment work plan. The main difference in modeling receptors in Clean Air Oregon versus a NAAQS analysis is, so in NAAQS, you have your ambient air boundary, and all receptors are treated the same. If you exceed at any receptor, you exceed. And in Clean Air Oregon, we have things called exposure locations. And so we are looking at 7 different types of risk. For instance, residential cancer or residential non-cancer would only be evaluated at a home or a place that is zoned for a home to be. And that is in contrast to a worker exposure or a child exposure that would happen at a school or a daycare. And then we have acute exposure that's evaluated everywhere. So all of those steps lead to a risk assessment where they do the modeling, do the post-processing. We have lots of different ways to do that. That if people are interested, I can talk during the Q&A about. But in the end, they get the risk results and they compare those to a risk action level, which triggers, say, having to have permit restrictions, maybe triggers community engagement if it's higher, or there's additional steps that would require risk reduction or potentially immediate curtailment of operations or permit denial for a new facility. So once we get those risk numbers, we determine what we need to do, and that goes into a permit. And I hope I'm getting a whole bunch of alerts on my phone. I hope it's not disrupting disrupting my voice here. But in the permit, that's where you would end up with what we call source risk limits. So next slide, please. And so for Clean Air Oregon, this is going to be a little bit of repetitive of what I just walked through, so I won't go into too much detail. But really what to point out here is we have our 7 different types of risk that's shown in this table. This is from a risk assessment report that we get. You see in this particular case, this data center at the fuel limit they requested reported an excess cancer risk of 9 excess cancers in a million. And that is above our community engagement level, which means it would trigger community engagement for the nearby community. And really what we see for our data centers is it's the PAHs and the metals, and then Oregon has a diesel particulate matter cancer value and it's those combination of those things that drive risk. Next slide. Okay, so what does it look like once we've done all of this modeling? We get risk results. It for data centers results in permit conditions that typically restrict annual and daily fuel use. So they will run their chronic risk assessment, so cancer, non-cancer, chronic risk assessments on an annual amount of fuel. Our emission factors are in pounds per 1,000 gallons, so it kind of directly relates to how much fuel they use. And so they will end up with a restriction. Here I have a snapshot of an actual permit for a data center. This section on source risk limits, which is showing up blurry on my phone, but hopefully that's just my phone, that restrict how much gallons of fuel they can use, again, for the non-emergency activity. So testing and maintenance, commissioning, source testing, things like that. It also has it for the daily fuel limit due to that acute risk. And then they will also get toxic contaminant emission limits in their permit that they have to show compliance with source testing. All new facilities must source test within 6 months of beginning operations. And then of course, monitoring and record keeping to show compliance and maintain that the risk that they modeled, they are keeping below. So next slide. All right, switching gears. So that was our toxics program that runs a risk assessment. And now moving on to short-term NAAQS. And I know this is a very interesting issue when it comes to EPA and what EPA recommends and how to model intermittent emissions to show compliance with those. In particular, I'm going to focus on the 1 hour standard, but it applies in some ways to that 24-hour PM 2.5 standard as well. And so, we know that these engines don't run all of the time. They are limited by federal standards to 100 hours per year. In our Cleaner Air Oregon program, they might be limited to even less operations based on that, cancer risk that comes out. And we know that running AirMod, assuming they're operating all hours at that full 100% load NOx emission rate, it is they're just going to exceed the standard. And so EPA came out with this intermittent memo saying, you could try annualizing the emissions, which is to take that, say, for instance, they release 50 pounds per hour. They run it for 100 hours a year, and then they divide by 8760, and that's the emission rate they put into AirMod. And so Oregon has looked into this, and we don't feel like it is protective of that actual 1 hour standard. And so we embrace the Monte Carlo approach, which was originally developed by Washington Ecology. Thank you if they're on the phone. They have a fabulous R script that runs a Monte Carlo using AirMod Max daily files. And so how this works is you set up your scenario, say your confidence testing runs at 10% load, and you run 1 to 2 engines, maybe 2 engines at a given time, and you'd have that scenario in AirMod using source groups. And AirMod's going to spit out per receptor for every single day of your modeling run, the max hour of that day. And what the R script and the Monte Carlo analysis is going to do is say, okay, that is a monthly testing scenario. You want to run that once a month. It's going to randomly select 1 day a month for that scenario. It's going to find the high 8th high. It's going to repeat that 1,000 times and find your average result per receptor. You kind of pile on all your different scenarios and make sure that when you run that, you're still under the NACs. And so what we have found is that those assumptions that go into that are really important to have as permit conditions to show that they are not going to cause a problem for this 1 hour standard. And so really why Oregon doesn't allow the EPA in annualizing approach is because you may actually end up with a very similar value of showing NACs compliance, but the EPA approach would not have any kind of baked in permit limits to restrict their operations in a way that protects that standard. And so next slide, please, I can go into what I mean by that. So here is a snapshot of a modeling report that we got from a data center that outlines what types of testing they do and what assumptions they baked into the modeling analysis. So first, they restrict the number of hours that testing can occur. And depending on the testing type, they have all sorts of assumptions that restrict the number of engines that can operate in any given hour. And that's based on the NO2 standard, or any given day. And that's for the PM 2.5 standard. You also see they're limiting the amount of time that each test can occur. In particular, and this is an Amazon facility, they are very precise. They are saying we are going to run this test at this many minutes at this load, this many minutes at that load, and all of that is going into their emission rates and their assumptions in that Monte Carlo analysis for how many engines are running at a given time. And so we really see that these types of restrictions are important to ensure protection of that standard. So next slide. And I just wanted to give a quick graphic to say, what do we see from these modeling results? And so I've got NO2 on the left and PM 2.5 on the right. These in each dot is a modeling analysis that we got. So for NO2, they all use Monte Carlo. For PM 2.5, some of them don't end up doing the Monte Carlo. They just restrict the number of engines that can operate in a given day. It's a mix on that side. But especially for NO2, even with all of these assumptions that go into how many engines will operate at a given time, what groups will operate at the same time, we see results almost always above 80% of the standard, many, 90% and above of the standard that we see. And so next slide. So what do we do for those permit conditions? I showed you an example of a source risk limit for our toxics program. This is an example. It's not the same facility that I showed all those endless assumptions, but because it was long. But here is another more simplified facility. And so, like I said, there is typical restrictions on the number of engines that can operate in the same hour or day. The 4.4b there is showing that they can only operate one generator at a given time for the purposes of testing and maintenance. And so this facility in particular had a testing and maintenance scenarios where they would go down, turn on an engine, make sure it's working, turn it off, go to the next engine, make sure it's working, turn it off. And so they were only testing one engine at a given time, and that is restricted in their permit. Also, almost all of our data centers restrict air mod to usually 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., sometimes a little bit different. So that is also a permit restriction. And lastly, there is a specific testing scenario that was important to this facility, that they have what is called a building transfer test, where every engine operates at one time. And they put that scenario into Monte Carlo, saying it will happen just once a year. So one day a year, all the engines are operating. And so that did pass the Monte Carlo along with their confidence testing. And so that becomes a specific permit condition, that when they do this test where all engines are operating, they cannot do it more than one day per calendar year. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just a little bit of fun lessons learned on the source testing side. This is particular for diesel particulate matter, which in the case of combusting diesel fuel would be kind of similar, PM 2.5 basically, but we test specifically for DPM for our Clean Air Oregon program. On the left-hand side, we have an uncontrolled emergency generator that we require testing at 10% and 90% load. They failed both their high load and their low load compared to their permitted limit. Digging deeper, it turned out their permit limit was based on a high load source test. So they really had no chance of passing a low load source test because, DPM is higher at a low load for an uncontrolled engine. And so this was a lesson learned on our end and their end. They did get a violation on the high load failure, but on the low load side, we allowed a permit modification so that they could change their permit to end up with load specific emission limits for these testings to avoid this scenario in the future. On the right hand side is a more interesting scenario. We had a facility that had regenerative DPFs, which mean that they are powered with electricity, and I'm not a particular control person, but it zaps it at regular intervals to keep it clean and allow it to be more effective. And so this, at the high load test, it failed quite badly. It was 340% of their limit over 3 tests. It was 13 compared to a limit of 4 pounds per 1,000 gallons. And if you look at the run breakdown there, that first test, which, keep in mind, the engine had been running for 2 full hours prior to the start of the test, was up at 37 pounds per 1,000 gallons compared to a limit of 4. This was very weird. It shouldn't do that with a regenerative DPF. We talked to the manufacturer of the controls. They said it was weird. They went out there, they did an inspection of these engines and the controls, and it turned out they didn't have any power to the controls. Apparently the little light that tells them there's power to the controls was like hidden inside something. And so this was really a lesson learned for everyone, really, that just because there are controls physically there, they have to be plugged in order to work in this case. And so really told us that we need to make sure we put conditions in our permits to ensure these controls are operating properly. So next slide. Okay, so how we have fully buried ourselves in what feels like endless modeling work for data centers here in Oregon. And so how are we keeping up with workload? We were instructed by our administrator to figure out a way to streamline permits that install Tier 4 compliant controls. So really, we we've heard from facilities that these data centers aren't going away. They're going to keep moving in to Oregon for the foreseeable future. And so we really want to incentivize facilities that have controls on these emissions if we can. And one thing to note is the controls are, for DPM, they're helpful at all loads. But for NOx, the SCRs take a while to heat up and turn on. And so it's less that we are getting a lot of benefit at low load scenarios for testing and maintenance, but it is really the emergency scenarios that we are not regulating, but we want to ensure that the public health is protected during those scenarios, that we're really trying to incentivize these tier 4 controls. So that being said, we set out to eliminate the need for facilities to do specific modeling and for us to review that specific modeling. And we went about it in 2 ways. First, to restrict for short-term NACs, to not have to do short-term NACs modeling. We looked at all of the data we had from our data centers, and we saw that if we kept the low load NOx emissions, so the regular confidence testing once a month, to 50 pounds per hour, we were confident that those types of facilities, based on that intermittent nature, would not cause a NACs exceedance. And so we're not worried about the high load because that's when those SCRs kick in and the NOx is controlled. We're also not worried about PM, which, assuming the controls are plugged in, those are, the PM is being controlled at all the time as well. So we said if you can keep your NOx low load scenario below 50 pounds per hour, and you agree to install controls and you agree to other kind of baked in permit conditions around source testing and things like that, you do not have to submit a short-term NACs analysis. So that kind of moved that modeling demonstration and workload kind of off the table. The next thing we did is created a Clean Air Oregon data center tool. And so this is based on those endless modeling submissions we have, knowing what are fairly common stack parameters, what scenarios we're worried about, things like that. We created a tool to calculate cancer, non-cancer, and acute risk from the data centers. It allows flexibility for the facility to select the specific stack height, building height, and location for their facility. And then it spits out basically permit-ready fuel limits. And so next slide. So this is a screenshot of what that looks like. I can't send you a link to it because it is on a server that is currently down due to the cyber attack, but I will send Jesse a whole list of links and stuff that might be of interest when things are up and running again. But this essentially allows you to put in input information about the facility, how far you are from homes and schools, information about the controls, the fuel usage of your engines, and it spits out risk based on a desired fuel limit or a fuel limit based on kind of staying below a risk action level. And so those go right into the permit and would take the other part of the modeling workload off the table for facilities that install controls. So next slide. Okay, so future adventures. I think this is my last slide. First is implementing that streamlined process to hopefully have less data center work on our plate, because I think probably all of us are in this call because we're getting tired of data centers. We don't quite know yet to be tired of data centers, but they are a lot of work. And so that we're going to begin implementing that process for those tier 4 controls that I just talked about. The other future adventure that's coming up is Clean Air Oregon is required by rule to reevaluate our toxicity reference values. So looking at health studies for all of our toxic air contaminants every 3 years. That process is currently in progress, and it is with an air toxic science advisory committee right now that is reviewing all of the proposed changed or new TRVs. And one of those proposals is our diesel particulate cancer value is currently not aligned with California and Washington's value, and that are used by those states. The value we're using was rescinded and we can no longer use it. And so if the proposed value, which is now aligned with California and Washington, were to be approved by our Environmental Quality Council, that would have a significant impact on data centers, and all of those data centers would need to reevaluate their risk and likely need to could potentially have to install filters to pass. So that is coming down the pipe, and hopefully we can use those incentivizing tools for Tier 4 engines and not have a little bit less work when it comes to data centers. So I think, Jesse, next slide. I think that was my last slide. Yep. Take questions now.
Great. Impeccable timing and wonderful, informative. Very informative presentation again. All right, I'm just going to turn the chat on. There we go. Once again, drop your questions in the chat. React with a thumbs up if you want us to prioritize a certain question. Oh my goodness, that is a long one. Okay.
And first, I can't see the questions, so.
Yeah, I'll read them out to you. All right, so the first one, Virginia provided a link to permits issued to data centers. Is this something Oregon can provide as well?
All of our permitted, all of our permits are available online. I can get that to you. I think that server is also down. So I think it will be a couple weeks maybe before I can send that along. But yes, I can get links to our permitted data centers.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I can send the links out in my follow-up email, but with the caveat that they might not be accessible for a little while. Okay. All right, the next question is really long. I'll do my best reading it out. Have you faced any litigation with respect to using variable emissions processing, i.e. Monte Carlo methods in state NSR modeling? If so, what was the outcome of that litigation? The question revolves around EPA's position, which does not allow for its use in PSD NSR modeling. I think you touched on that a bit, Kristen. Several states are concerned about even using the method on a state permitting level because it might result in litigation. EPA has been somewhat vague on the precise legal concerns. I'll stop there. There's a little bit more to the question, but do you have anything on the first part of the question?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So not for a data center specifically, but we had a PSD. So first of all, we have not had any litigation for just our state new source review program against using the Monte Carlo approach. So that we haven't had any issues with. I can say that we had an interesting solution to this with EPA. We had a source that was triggering a PSD modification. And it is not a data center, but they have 90 emergency engines at their facility, which is, basically a data center, even though they do a whole bunch of other stuff. But they had 90 diesel generators without controls. And so we said, we're going to treat you like a data center in your modeling approach. You have to do the Monte Carlo. And they said, okay. And then it's a PSD source. So EPA saw that and said, no. So they really wanted the annualized approach. And so we came up with a solution in which the source submitted the modeling report with the annualized approach and added an appendix with the Monte Carlo approach to make us happy. So we could keep both EPA happy with the annualized approach and us happy with the Monte Carlo. And that is actually what led me to say, you might see, those two came out with pretty similar results. But with the annualized approach, there's no permit conditions to restrict the assumptions they used in what ended up in the Monte Carlo approach. So that's why we kind of lean on the Monte Carlo approach more. But EPA was okay with that approach. They allowed the supplemental information to hold.
Thank you.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah. Then there's a few more questions from the same person, but I'm gonna just go to some of the other questions from other folks and then come back to that, just so that we can give these other people a chance to have their questions answered. So thank you for the great presentation. For the short-term NAAQS analysis, how do you deal with background, particularly 1 hour NO2, especially given the huge growth in data centers in specific areas over a short amount of time?
Good call. So most of them, when they do the modeling, they will put in a seasonal hourly background value from a monitor, and they've been able to pass with that. We do have one caveat for a policy perspective when it comes to competing sources as part of it's a little bit different than background, but I think it maybe would be helpful for this question. We have, if you're not triggering state news source review, we do not require a competing source analysis for our 1 hour NO2 analysis. We do still for PM 2.5, but our argument is that, intermittent nature of data centers, we don't expect the plumes to overlap in a given hour. And so we did make that policy decision to not include, especially when you're a data center with a ton of other data centers, that we don't expect the plumes to overlap in a given hour. So, but that does not apply if you trigger a new source review. You do have to add them in as a competing source.
Thank you. What are the risk levels Oregon used for cancer, non-cancer, and acute risks? Do you also account for background risks when conducting modeling?
We do not include background risk, but so the risk action levels are, so I talked about new sources because that's what mostly impacts our data centers. We have separate risk action levels for new facilities versus existing facilities. New facilities, so a 0.5 cancer risk triggers permitting, and a excess cancer risk of 5 triggers community engagement, and then a risk of 10 would trigger some type of called TLAIR, basically best controllable technology, and then 25 is permit denial level for excess cancer risk. On the acute side, for a new facility, it is a hazard index of 1, essentially is everything from community engagement to permit denial. The levels are higher if you're an existing facility. And those are, I think I saw a question pop up. Those are our values set. I think a baseline value was set by the legislature, and then in the rulemaking, we set those kind of intermittent steps.
Thank you. Okay, so this question, it looks like somebody responded to it, but I guess I'll see if you have anything you want to add. Why limit operating hours to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.? Isn't there less effect on NOx emissions during time when the sun is not causing photochemical reactions, putting aside the neighborly noise issues? And then the response that we got was from Renil, who I think is with Washington.
He used to be with Washington, and he wrote that R code, but now he's with South Coast. So.
Okay. The hour of day limit is to ensure data center generator testing isn't carried out outside those hours. No consideration of ozone formation here may become necessary in the future.
Yeah,
do you have
exactly.
anything to add?
That's yeah. I mean, we are so in AirMod. There's better dispersion during daylight hours, and so there's a benefit in AirMod when it comes to NO2 modeling to be operating during the daylight. But it hasn't been that we've had to worry about ozone over here as much. But I mean, it's a great point, and they're at odds with each other. And I know the East Coast has more of those concerns.
Okay. Apologies for any background noise that you all just heard. Okay, and then can you put the link to the CIO tool in the chat? So yeah, as Kristen said, the tool is unfortunately not going to be accessible for the time being, but I will share the link in a follow-up email, and I guess you all can just keep checking it, and hopefully it'll get back online soon. Anything to add to that, Kristen, or?
Yeah, they told us yesterday they're hoping the servers are up by tomorrow, but I don't know if that will count the tool is on a specific R server, which I don't think is a priority for them right now getting up and running. But yeah, really, I have no idea when things will get back to normal. Don't click on the bad link.
Yeah. Okay, did Oregon create their own risk action levels, or do you use EPA action levels such as 10 to 100 in a million? Do you consider background emissions when calculating risk?
Yeah, I think we got part of that.
Oh,
but
yeah. Sorry about
so,
that.
and also our Cleaner Oregon website does list our risk action levels. They are our own levels. They are not EPA levels.
Okay. All right. Go through. Okay, great. Looks like Nancy responded to a previous question. The Oregon. Oh, Susan is asking, are the servers that went down in a data center? I had the same question.
I think we have our own data centers that they've told us. Like, I don't know. It's a mess. It's a mess. They have to rebuild it from a backup. So we lost like a full week of work.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
They got to be somewhere, right? Data.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this first multi-question question. Now that we have a little bit of time left. Sorry if you kind of already addressed this, but how do you handle a source that is permitted using variable emissions processing, but is then required to be modeled as a nearby source in a future PSD modeling exercise, particularly given the EPA OAQPS current negative stance on EMVAP or other similar programs in PSD and SR? A lot of acronyms there.
Yeah, I think, let me know if this answers the question or not, but in talking with, we have Region 10 out here, in talking with them about NO2 competing sources for the 1 hour standard, they allow essentially the annualized method as part of the competing sources. So if we are dealing with a demonstration specifically for EPA, we will do that, because it's kind of our stance that for data centers and the different intermittent nature and the plumes, we don't expect them to overlap very much. So we don't prioritize it. And then EPA says, oh, just annualize the emissions. And to be fair, once you annualize the emissions, it all goes away anyway. I don't know. Did that answer that question?
I don't know. Okay, yes. Michael says yes. Okay, and then have you employed ambient monitoring around the data centers, particularly in high density areas? If so, how does the monitoring compare to the modeling using the variable emissions processing? Is that comparison publicly available? If so?
We don't yet we haven't put up any industry specific modeling around data centers yet. I can say that facility that I was talking about, that was the PSD action, as part of that analysis. So that was one of those that Rap was talking about earlier. There was a lot of pressure on us for that particular facility, but we did push hard and say we want monitoring set up. And that particular facility is located surrounded by data centers, even though it itself is not a data center. And so we will, in the future, once those monitors get set up, they're related to when the construction happens. We will start to get some data on NO2, and I think PM 2.5 is in there too, to have some fence line monitoring essentially across the street from data centers, and also a facility with 90 emergency generators. That is not a data center.
Thank you. And then the last question here, are all EPA regions in agreement with annualizing?
Yeah, so my understanding is that is not coming from the regions, that is coming from headquarters. I don't know if anyone attends RSL meetings, but George Bridger is really very clear in those meetings that they don't like the Monte Carlo approach. I don't know if they're all for just annualizing it in general, but that was the feedback we got when we talked to them about that PSD action.
Right. Okay. We are at 2:29, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you, Nancy and Louisa, for your informative presentations. Please stay tuned for future learning opportunities on the topic of data centers and air quality, as the number of registrations and the amount of attendance that we got in this webinar series is indicative of a growing interest in these topics, and particularly with the context of a changing regulatory environment and all of that. So do stay tuned for future opportunities. And we appreciate all of you who attended the whole series. And thank you again to all of our presenters. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, guys.